So can men in the podcast space be truly taken seriously if they don't practice accountability on and off the mic? All right, y'all, let's get into the definitions for this week. So the first one is downfall, a loss of power, prosperity, or status, the cause of ruin or failure. So in this episode, we're going to be questioning whether podcasts are actually a vehicle for male healing or just a a microphone for amplifying the undoing. The second one is ego, a person's sense of self-esteem or self-importance. So is your podcast about community and clarity, or is it unchecked ego trip marked as wisdom? There's a such thing as false wisdom. Accountability, excuse me. It says the obligation or willingness to accept responsibilities for one's actions and their consequences. So can men in the podcast space be truly taken seriously if they don't practice accountability on and off the mic? I'm big on accountability. We preach accountability here. All right, y'all, let's go ahead and move to the next segment for today, which is what does this have to do with mental health? All right. So in the first part, I have 4 reputable sources, and we're going to go through them real quick. So the first one, The Guardian. It's an article. It's titled Beyond Andrew Tate, Promoters of Misogyny Online. So how it affects men putting mic content. According to The Guardian, platforms like podcasts popularize aggressive misogynistic content from men like Andrew Tate and groups like Fresh and Fit. It says this reinforces what we know is toxic masculinity, narratives promotes unhealthy behavior, and deepens emotional disconnection among male creators. So many young men walk away with distorted ideas about women, power, and vulnerability. It says Meds Internet, podcast, and mental, physical, and combined health. Okay, so it says how it affects men receiving content. According to JMed Internet Resolution, although podcasts are widely used to promote mental and physical well-being, the majority of health-related podcast formats remain untested and unregulated. This means men consuming motivational or advice content may adopt unverified or harmful narratives disguised as support. Without standards in podcast content, listeners risk internalizing misinformation and emotional misguidance. Now, the beauty of my podcast is I do my research and I do find real reputable sources. And I also have people who are the licensed professionals. So I don't want to be pushing out false information. And if I ever do, I want to correct it. I've said it, corrected myself before. The third source talks about the rehabilitation and research and rural health. It says that how this affects the listeners. So according to this source, mental health podcasts may improve literacy and reduce stigma, but poor quality content or lack of nuance can mislead listeners. When men listen to unrefined or sensational takes, they're more likely to self-diagnose or avoid professional help. Accessibility is great, but without critical thinking and personal accountability, the medium becomes a distraction, not healing. Now, one thing we always promote, it's in my bio, this is not a replacement for therapy, but it can be a good start. We've had licensed professionals say that podcasts, especially ones that are geared towards that, can help to start, and books to start. But you shouldn't use that to just stay there. If you can, you should still go talk to somebody. Of course, people don't have the means, but even it was said on this podcast by a licensed professional that until you get the means, use the podcast and the books to just kind of help you coast through it. I can't really see God. Like, y'all, I'm telling you, I know it's easier said than done, and I'm gonna have somebody really break down some steps on how to do that. But I'm telling you from experience, like, as somebody who used to have mental health diagnosed with some who was literally diagnosed with some disorders by a therapist, and now I'm over past that. I'm telling you, if I was doing both at the same time, but he didn't say you couldn't do both. There are some people I do believe was radically delivered from their mental illnesses and mental, the issues that they had, but doing both, walking with God and going therapy, is okay too. The final is what toxic masculinity is and how it impacts mental health. So how it affects producers and consumers. According to APA, toxic masculinity reinforced by platforms like male host podcasts tell men to suppress emotion, avoid vulnerability, and project dominance. Podcast hosts spreading these narratives perpetuate social isolation, emotional paralysis, and unhealthy expectations for men in the relationships and mental health. The programming harm both speakers and listeners. So even with that, like, I'm never going to say suppress your emotions. Now, let's talk about it. So on today's episode of Izzy's Notes on Instagram, I did say that as a man, you shouldn't be complaining. Now, people here complaining, venting and complaining aren't the same thing. I didn't do the due diligence of getting the definitions right now, but I'm going to do it later. I'm going to do it for next episode, and I'm going to break them down. So hold me accountable to that. But venting and opening up and complaining to me is whining. Complaining is, oh, this ain't right. Why is this like this? It could have been a little better.